All right, welcome to a special edition of Innovator Stories. I'm John Greathouse. I'm here at UC Santa Barbara, and we're here with Laura McCormick. She's principal at McCormick PR. Laura's consultancy specializes in brand building through high-impact media and analyst relations. And what I want to make clear is she's building brands through corporate communications and public relations. She's not building brands through other marketing mechanisms that we'll talk about. So when we think about brand building, we often think about certain ads or iconic things that Steve Jobs has done. Laura works with people that are doing that, and she works in concert with them, and we'll explain how she does that. She honed her skills at top-rated PR agencies as a young person, including Burson Marsteller, where she supervised Fortune 500 companies, and DeVries, where she was a senior vice president, and she led the creation of global consumer brands. She's also worked in-house, so she has her own firm now. She worked at some of the most prestigious firms in in New York. And she's also worked inside of companies, so she's really gotten to see the industry from several areas. She ran global PR at Kinkos, which is now known as FedEx Office. When she left, they had over 900 stores in 9 different countries. And she was also the VP of Communications at Citrix Online. And she helped build that brand, one of which was GoToMeeting, among others, into a product that resulted in hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue and millions of customers. And it ultimately ended in a successful acquisition of that company by Citrix. She's now self-employed. I like to call her an entrepreneur. That's not a title she wants put on her, but I'll whisper it. She's an entrepreneur. But she's self-employed with her own agency, and what's great about this point in her life is she can pick the deals, she can pick the company she wants to work with, and she can add value with, and she can refer clients to other people that she thinks might be a better fit for her. So it's a wonderful place for her to be in her life. She represents brands from all over the world, and she came all the way from the East Coast to share her insights with us in our classroom. Let's give her a warm welcome. Thank you, Laura.
Good job.
So good to see you again.
Nice to see you too. Yeah.
So I want to start with just that distinction that I alluded to in the introduction, which is the distinction between corporate communications and marketing. They're under the same umbrella, and oftentimes maybe one person will supervise both endeavors. But what is how do you describe that distinction? And if you want to share a little bit about how you would work with marketing teams.
Yes, all right, good. That's a good question, a good way to start. The corporate communications discipline typically includes several communications departments. One would be public relations. In some companies, there's analyst relations. In some companies, there's customer communications. And internal communications, that's communications within a company. Those disciplines typically fall under corporate communications. In some companies, the head of corporate communications will report right into a CEO. In some cases, they report into marketing. A lot of the work in corporate communications will have to take public relations as a very important component of corporate communications. That's typically all about building reputation and awareness and demand through earned channels.
We've talked a little bit about earned channels in here.
Great, okay, terrific. Not exclusively, but yeah, that's terrific. And then the marketing umbrella, as you say, John, consists of advertising, lead generation, those disciplines that are designed to drive sales. A little less about maybe reputation, because reputation, really is earned through credible third-party means.
Right.
And typically, companies pay for advertising and lead generation channels. Whereas if you compare that to the public relations aspect, that's earned. So you don't pay for a story in the New York Times or in any publication. You earn it through your pitch, through the product, why it's important and newsworthy.
And that's a good overview. We've talked about social norming in here, and we've talked about the power of credibility. Yeah. People are going to obviously be more influenced by a messenger that they think is credible than on somebody that's paid spokesman. Even though we still see ads that say paid spokesman right under them, and
yes,
they seem to work at some level. But you began your career, I believe it was at Burson Marsteller. Is that correct?
Well, actually, that was the beginning of my career in public relations.
The reason I was asking about them is I'm wondering, as a college student or as a young person, what drove you to want to get into the PR industry?
That's a great question, because it wasn't a direct path. It was a bit indirect. I first started out in the fashion business. That was my passion. So I was working for a company in New York and loving it. And I was asked to travel to Toronto to help the Canadian operation, fill in for their promotion manager who left abruptly, and her assistant left. So I was in my mid-20s at that point, and said, great, I'll go up and help out. I was just there, during the week, and I was flown back to New York. I really loved what I was doing. I hadn't done promotion or PR at that point.
Yeah, what were you doing initially with the fashion company?
In the fashion company, I was doing merchandising,
okay,
for the most part. And that merchandising was determining what designs and what styles would be sold in to department stores. And so that was basically the merchandising aspect. But I really knew the company, and so based on that, I was asked to help out. What I found is I really enjoyed working with the media, and I was effective with it.
You were.
So, well,
I know firsthand.
That led me to, I made a decision at that point. I decided that I would pursue a career in public relations.
Got it.
So that's when I joined Burson Marsteller, and I actually joined Burson Marsteller in Toronto.
Okay.
Because I actually lived in Toronto for a few years.
Oh,
the company asked me to stay, and I did for a few years. But then I transitioned to Burson Marsteller, where I wanted to learn the tools of the trade from the best in the business.
I mean, it was the epicenter of corporate communications, right, at that point? And
Yes, and Burson was a huge company, and it still is. It's a global communications company. And after beginning with them in Toronto, then I moved back to New York with them, and I worked for them in the New York office.
A great proving ground. I just want to touch upon one thing you said. It's advice I often give my students is be a yes. So when an opportunity, especially early in your career, when you have an opportunity put forth, lean in with a yes. You can still be thoughtful, but all too often we talk ourselves out of doing things that involve a little bit of risk or a little bit of hassle, where in retrospect, come on, when you have a mortgage and kids and have, just all these other things that you need to consider, it's much harder to be a yes. So be a yes when you're young, please.
Completely.
My advice to you. So if you were advising one of these people that should be a yes, as I mentioned in your introduction, you've been in-house with great companies. You've been with some of the most prestigious PR firms, working with some of the biggest brands. Would you guide a student to go to a large agency initially, a smaller boutique agency, or would you say go in-house somewhere?
It's a great question, and I would say there's no clear-cut answer. What I will say is the traditional path would be to start out in a PR agency, and then where you gain the skills across a broad swath of industries, and then transition to the corporate side if that's what a person wants to do. Now, many people just stay with agencies. So that's the classic path. It's not the path that I necessarily took, because I started on the client side in a sense, and then I joined the agency. Let's just say, since this is technology focused, there are a lot of ways to gain tremendous experience going directly to the client side. For example, when you look at the large Microsoft, Apple, Cisco, enormous companies, their PR departments are enormous. So if you had an entry-level position in a company like that, you would have an opportunity to learn from some of the top pros in the business, and you'd have a lot of variety in what you're doing. So that's why I say it depends. It can go either way.
Right.
I would say, though, if you go the agency route, mid-size to large is the best path, as opposed to a very small agency just starting out.
Right.
Because you'll get more experience.
Right, right. And they're trying to find their way as an agency.
That's right. And one other thing I would add, there are a lot of agencies that are specialized in technology, specialized in entertainment. If you know that you want to be in a certain industry, then I would say go after an agency that specializes in that industry. Whereas if you're not sure, then I would go to a generalist agency where you might have an opportunity to go across industry.
Right, and learn what really excites you.
Yes.
So I completely agree. It does depend, and there's no right answer. Yeah. When a student approaches me with certain alternatives, one of my questions generally is, who will you learn the most from? and that often is the people, right? It's also the industry, it's also their customers and their market, but it's, where do you feel like you're getting that positive energy? Where's that chemistry where someone's going to take the time to teach you, because not everybody will?
Well, yeah. Now, in an agency, for example, at Burson Marsteller, I was in a large agency, and there were many titles. There was a junior account executive, a senior account executive, an account supervisor, and a senior account manager and a vice president. So you might have had almost 10 people on an account team. So you'd start out at the bottom rung, and you would basically be promoted and learn from the different levels. I find that there are fewer titles today. There's a narrower funnel in most agencies and account teams. But yes, I should say though that typically an agency will hire somebody who has had maybe some experience, maybe studied communications in college, or just had a good track record in school, and then you start out at the bottom level, which is fine.
It is a nice industry in that regard, where it's not like accounting or some of these other ones where you have to have a pretty rigid introductory degree.
Right. There's no degree required in
And
PR.
UCSB has a great communications program, and a number of those students do go into corporate communications.
Yes.
But I want to ask you about learning at companies. So we talked about, that's obviously a criteria you should look at closely. What about mentors in your past? And I know you're a fantastic mentor to a few people that I've worked with and know, and you still keep in touch with some of those folks. How about in your past? Like, did you have the benefit of mentors early? And if you did, what was that experience like?
When I started out, the idea of a mentor wasn't really the rage that it became later on in my career at the mid-level.
I agree.
Everybody was talking about having a mentor. So I considered my mentors the people I reported to for the most part. And I was fortunate because I did, for the most part, have people who respected me and wanted me to succeed. So I had that benefit.
Right.
And I moved around a little bit. And in the agencies, I moved from one department to the next, and I was in Toronto, and then I moved to New York. So I had the benefit, too, of different cultural experiences, in a sense.
Right.
So I consider them my mentors,
Good.
the people I admired.
Yeah, I always encourage students, recent graduates, young people, to seek out those people, not with a sign that says, will you be my mentor? But again, who can I learn from? Where is there a two-way interaction they might can learn from me? I'm seeing things, parts of the world they're not seeing.
That's right.
Let's talk a little bit about, again, on the theme of learning. So one of the experiences that at the time was, I'm sure, not ideal, but you learned a tremendous amount from it, was some of the tampering crisis that you had to deal with when you were part of that PR agency. I'd love for you to just give us a little color on the incident itself, but then also how it affected your point of view regarding future, because even at our little company we had crisis of sorts, not tampering.
That's
right.
right.
And then sorry, lastly, it's a multi-part question.
Yes.
I think this would be a good chance to touch upon mediums versus message strategy.
Sure.
So the mediums are new now, are different now. Maybe you're going to get your word out on Twitter, you're going to get your word out on another platform. But the strategy behind those messages themselves is probably very similar.
Sure. Well, let me start out with crisis.
Yeah.
Because I was fortunate in a sense that I joined Burson Marsteller when the company had just come out of one of the textbook cases. It's considered a textbook case today in crisis management, and that was the Tylenol incident. I mentioned Contact, and I'll talk a little bit about them both.
Please.
But Tylenol had a crisis, a major crisis in 1982. 7 people died from taking the the Tylenol. And you can imagine what a disaster that could be for any company. Yep. Tylenol was the leading medication in its category. So Johnson & Johnson was the company who was behind Tylenol. They actually found out about this through the news media.
Oh, wow.
And so that they had to really move very, very quickly in managing this crisis. Burson Marsteller was one of their agencies. And so the Burson Marsteller account team at that time worked hand in hand with their corporate communications team and marketing team to manage the crisis. And I could go on about this, but basically what happened is that the PR teams were very successful in managing it, getting information out in a credible way, building trust. The company was able to communicate a concern for the customers as opposed to a concern for the bottom line.
Right. Yep.
And then within a relatively short period of time, Tylenol came back to achieve, the same level of market share. And in fact, when that crisis first struck, the industry felt, oh, Tylenol will never come back. They'll have to just take it off the market.
Yeah.
So fortunately, now I moved to the New York office about a year after that happened, and I was on the contact cold medicine team, and something similar happened in a sense that it was a crisis, but not as large as Tylenol. Some stockbroker who tried to manipulate the price of the stock and was behind the tampering for contact. So fortunately, Burson Marsteller had the benefit of the Tylenol crisis, and in basically the same steps. Immediately, get behind it, get information out credibly, get a top spokesperson from the company trained, carefully message, what should be said by all the spokespeople involved from a company, and keep the information flowing.
Right.
Don't ever say no comment. We don't know. You can say we don't know, but we'll get right back to you. As soon as we learn more, because sometimes information happens. I mean, these things happen so quickly that you can't possibly know everything right away.
Yeah, and I think one thing you said really resonated with me about the focus on the customer, the consumer, and not the focus on the company.
Oh, yes.
Oftentimes we see the playbook, the bad playbook of PR is circle the wagons.
Yes.
Let's just protect the individuals at the company. And I think there's a balance act. Nobody expects you to throw your company away, but they also want to make sure that your heart is in the right place and you are concerned about what's happening with your users.
That's right. And what I should say, and maybe you'd like to talk about this later on, but I'll say what happened after Tylenol was an awareness of the need for crisis communications preparedness. Companies now knew they needed to be prepared before a crisis hit. So today, a big part of what agencies do is prepare their clients for a crisis. And you sometimes can never be prepared because not all crises, are in the playbook, or can be predicted. But most of them can be. Most will fall into a certain category. So companies need to do risk modeling and determine where can they be vulnerable. It's no longer a product or an ad campaign. Now, as we found out from the Subway situation and their spokesperson, it could be the people, who are hired to represent the brand and what's behind them, what's in their background. The Me Too movement is spawning another whole level of crisis preparedness. Executives, really are now being coached to go back into their backgrounds and, were there any vulnerabilities? Even in their college yearbook, as most of you probably know. This level of scrutiny now is being spawned by social media.
Well, and I think because of that, and even before that, we've talked in this classroom about having a core ethical foundation to your business. So that, because you're right, you can't predict every incident that might happen, but you can say, if something happens, here's how we're going to react. Customers always first, or whatever.
That's right.
Stakeholders are going to be looked at first before ourselves, whatever those core values are.
That's right.
And I think that if that's a big help, because when everybody looks around going, what do we do? What do we do? Go back to your core values. They'll tell you what you should do.
And the other thing that's important, once a company, once a department creates a crisis preparedness plan that discusses the different eventualities and what might come up and here's how we would respond, the executives need to be trained. So the training should take place maybe even annually. So that there's no scrambling. There's a process, and the key stakeholders in a company know what their role is and what will have to be done to mitigate
It's so funny when you see, because I had a little bit of media training, not a lot, just a touch. And the little bit I had, I can see it when people are doing it poorly. And the athletes crack me up because I see these athletes, and they need it. They need the training, right? But you can just tell that they just got the training because they're doing like all the five things you're supposed to do. And, or if somebody's selling a book and they're not used to selling a book. And it's just, if you've been through it, you kind of see a little bit more. So let's talk about Kinkos. I'm interested in how you went in-house. What was the state of the business like when you arrived? And in your intro, I talked about where it was when you left. And what were your goals when you first got there?
Okay, that's really great. I love talking about Kinkos.
Yeah, that's a great story.
Yes, I was really, I was approached by a search firm, and I was working in New York at DeVries Public Relations, a job I loved as well. And I was asked to consider, becoming the head of public relations for Kinkos. I was aware of Kinkos. Kinkos had stores in the East Coast. It was primarily a West Coast company that moved east.
Started in IV.
A major force started right here in Santa Barbara. Paul Orfila was one of the great entrepreneurs. And so I accepted the job. I thought it would be terrific to work in California for a couple of years and to work for a force. Kinkos in the early years was a college-based copy shop.
Right.
But over the years, through a crisis, through a lawsuit, an industry lawsuit, they were sued for copyright infringement. And they repositioned themselves as your branch office. They became a service for the legions of small business owners who needed a place to get their work done, to get their copies made, to do video conferencing. In any event, Kinkos had about 128 partners who collectively owned the 800 plus stores worldwide. And they were at a point where a number of their partners were looking to take their equity out. So the company was considering a couple of different avenues for that. But they knew that they needed to manage their image, their reputation, and build it, because quite frankly, Kinkos was a very private company. The owner and the large partners liked it that way. That was part of their strategy. We want to remain anonymous and quiet. Not anonymous, but quiet, basically. So I was hired by the head of marketing to turn that around. And it was actually it was a wonderful public relations experience because it was a great story. Kinkos was so innovative, and the founder, Paul Orfila, was so interesting.
Yes.
On many levels.
I've gotten to know him. Yes.
You've got to know him.
Yes.
He was a great innovator, and he was a natural spokesperson. He was not. He was just a natural in so many ways. Unconventional.
Charming,
that's right. So the media were interested, and I'll tell you a quick story. Within about a month of being with Kinkos, Forbes magazine, at that time there was a physical magazine, was keen on doing a story on Kinkos, and Kinkos had video conferencing. So we did the interview in a video conferencing room at the headquarters. The Forbes reporter went to a video conference, I think at one of the Kinkos stores in New York, and it was a fabulous way to
using the product,
show the technology, and have her meet Paul. So it was wonderful in a sense that there hadn't been a lot of publicity. Once that Forbes story ran, the partners became more comfortable with the idea of being out there in other media. So from there, then we pursued stories in other top media. We had 11 pages in Wired magazine at one point. And that was when Wired magazine was just starting.
Back when it mattered. And it's hard for folks now to think about it, but there was an era, right, where the magazines drove sales.
Oh yes, print was very important. And I'll address that because print still is important, but it's changing. So that was my experience at Kinkos. I was there to help build reputation for the company and awareness of the products and services. Crisis communications loomed large with Kinkos. Kinkos was open 24 hours, 7 days a week, and there were a lot of incidents in the middle of the night. that had to be managed.
I bet,
So that
I
was
bet.
an important part of the communications mix.
So before I move on from Kinkos, just quickly, I
Yes.
know in here we've talked about how startups, and I would think Kinkos wasn't a startup, but they were still a smaller company.
Yeah.
It's very important to understand your ecosystem, partner effectively within your ecosystem. You were involved with cutting deals with Apple and Adobe and obviously FedEx, which led to the acquisition. Can you share any insights on how those deals were structured and how they helped the company at its relatively nascent stage?
Yeah. Actually, while I was involved in some of the conversations behind the deals, John, I was mostly involved in promoting the partnerships
relationships.
and the relationships.
Right. So you were trying to gain validation in the marketplace by saying, look, Adobe is our partner,
Yes.
Apple's our partner.
I'll give you one example. During WebEx, when WebEx approached Kinkos, when I was there
Yep.
in the late 90s, about some sort of a partnership or a cross-promotional opportunity, and so my role and my team's role in that would have been to promote the value proposition of that through PR channels. Same thing with Microsoft and Apple. Kinkos was Xerox's biggest customer at that time. So there was a lot of cross promotion with Xerox as well.
Right.
Yes.
Makes sense. Yeah, because it's one thing to do the partnership, it's another thing to make it work. Like I
Right.
was often on the front end of making the partnerships, creating them, but then Brian
Yes.
and you and other
Yes.
people would make them successful.
Right.
You did the hard
But,
part.
well,
You did the hard part. So I talk a lot about networking, the importance of networking to everyone, but especially younger people. I've told this story before. Please bear with me.
Sure.
The story about how we met you. If you could just share that you were at a networking event and kind of how Andreas saw you. I think it was a red jacket or something. And the reason I like that story is you never know where life's going to take you.
Right.
Like you could have just not gone to that event. You
That's
could have
right.
just said, you know what, it's raining, screw it, I'm not doing it. But you didn't, and you put yourself out there. And then more importantly, so part of it's showing up, but part of it is understanding your personal pitch, who you are, where you're going, and how you're going to get there. And by that
Yes.
time in your career, you obviously had that down. So
Yes.
can you
Well,
just
I'll
remind me and
try to
share
give
with
you
everyone?
some highlights of that. I had left Kinkos after working for them for about 5 years to join a startup. Now this is 2001 when markets are rattling, and I took a big risk in that, in wanting to make a move. But I was willing to take that risk. What I didn't realize is the startup collapsed before I could join them. So at that point, I was considering moving back to the East Coast, and I was interviewing seriously on both coasts, and a friend of mine said, you really should come to this networking event. Well, I had just come back from actually an interview with the New York Times.
Oh, wow.
And I was tired, but I said sure, and that was the
You
event
were a yes.
where Andreas was talking at
Yep,
that event.
yep.
And yes, I had a red jacket on, and I mentioned to Brian Donahue at that point, who was at the door checking people in.
Oh.
I just happened to say that I was here to network, that I had been at Kinkos and I had also agency experience. So Brian remembered that.
Yep.
And Andreas is talking about go to my PC. At this point, it was just being
Right,
launched, just
right.
being in the early stages, pre-launch.
Yep.
So in any event, Andreas pointed out to me as an example of a person who might need this product, I think, when traveling. So in any event, I said, oh, great, I'll say hello to this person at the end of the presentation. But I didn't because he was swarmed with people. And
Right.
it was a convoluted series of things. I ended up running into Andreas again at another event, at another networking event. But at that point, Andreas found out that I had a background in PR from talking to Brian, and so and also one of your venture, the capitalists in New York, had my resume.
Ed Sim, probably.
Ed Sim had my resume because I had a cousin who knew him, and he had sent my resume at the same time to Andreas.
The world is small.
So they connected the dots and realized I was that person.
Yep.
So at that time, I had an offer from a traditional Hollywood company, big company with a sterling reputation. Stable and old line. And I was thinking about it, and then I had the offer from Expert City. And I made the decision to join Expert City because I felt that, number one, I knew it would be more entrepreneurial. And after working at Kinkos, which was a very entrepreneurial corporation, I would be happier there. And I felt I'd have more autonomy than this staid traditional company where I would be reporting into marketing.
Right.
And I felt there'd be more upside financially if the company was successful.
Sure. But it's funny because so oftentimes you'll hear in startups hire somebody above their weight class. So in other words, it means hire a younger person that has the ability to get better. With Laura, it was kind of the opposite. Like I always felt like you were above our weight class. Like you were just so talented so far in your career. You did put Kinkos on the map. I mean, you really did. They weren't a household name before that. And so we were just so lucky that the timing worked for you and worked for us, and you did such a fantastic job for us. So I'm just so glad that little serendipitous series of events worked out. So you did go to IPC and then later go to Meeting, et cetera, in international brands. You and a small team, very small team, were very passionate and tenacious. You worked the phones. You were selling, basically. You were selling this idea that remote work was coming and this tool was better. So one of the things I remember is you had David Pogue for the New York Times and Walt Mossberg from the Wall Street Journal. They're fierce to this day. They're fierce competitors, right? They both want the story first. You got both of them to write about us within, as I remember, a couple weeks, which is unheard of. And our servers went down because we had so much activity, which was another crisis. Talk a little bit about the mishap at Walt's office. And I think, to me, that anecdote just speaks volumes to the charm and the credibility that you had, that even with a mishap, he still wrote a glowing article about us.
Well, I would say the charm was all Andreas's.
Oh, I think it was a tag team.
Yes.
Though he was very charming.
Sure. Let me tell you a little bit about how it happened that the New York Times wrote the story first. This was at around the time when I was now joining the company, and there was a great team in place. So the information about the product and trials, had already gone out to David and to some of the other, leaders in technology. David gave the assurance that he would do a story, and so for whatever reason, that was great. To get the go-ahead from the New York Times to do a story, you run with it.
Especially at the stage we were at. We were a small company.
Yes. Well, that story was phenomenal. I frankly, in all the years in public relations, other than Kinkos and 11 pages in Wired, that story in the New York Times was a half page in the circuits section, which doesn't exist anymore, but that was their technology section. And David used words like ingenious to describe Go to My PC. I mean, it was just a dream come true for the company. So in any event, of course, in my team, we really needed to get to the Wall Street Journal too, because Walt Mossberg was considered the, the guru. That he truly was a person who could change a business. The New York Times, very large circulation, but the Wall Street Journal has a larger circulation, and it's more of a business audience. So in a sense, Walt was more powerful. And if you had Walt write about a product in his personal technology column, it could make the difference in a business. So when I spoke to Walt, he said to me, well, I was really surprised that you didn't come to me earlier. He didn't say the New York Times. So that was fine, but he said, please come to meet me in my office in Washington, D.C. So Andreas and I went out and met with him. And yes, as you said, at first when we were doing the demonstration, for whatever reason, it didn't work. And Andreas, it was fine. I could tell that Walt liked Andreas,
Yep.
and not unusual, certainly.
Yes. Everybody likes
everybody
Andreas.
liked Andreas. And in any event, the next try was the charm.
Yes,
It
yes.
did work, and we could see Walt Mossberg's eyes just light up. He thought, wow, this is really cool. It was like the great professor was seeing something that was truly unique and innovative.
It was.
That could really change the way people worked at the time.
But he was so difficult to get to. I mean, I think the fact that you
Yeah.
got to the two leading tech writers, and later, or might have been before, the editor-in-chief of PC Magazine wrote
yes.
their incredible
Yes.
review, and that was
Yes.
largely.
And I would say I really had a great team.
Yeah,
I
well,
had a great team
you're being
of people.
modest. Your team was very good. They were very, very good. But you guys
Yes.
did. I've joked in this class. I've joked in other classes that when people would ask me who does your PR, I would say Laura McCormick, and they would start like looking up the firm. But I'm like, no, she works down the hall.
That's sweet.
But that's how
yeah.
good it was. I mean, that's how good your PR was. They just assumed it had to be a big company. So what do you remember? We talk a bit about guerrilla marketing
Yes.
in this class. Any scrappy? Because I wouldn't let anybody spend any money at the company. So what were some scrappy?
remember that.
I know, I do too. Not the favorite part of my job.
Yes.
What are some things that we did that you recall?
Okay, thank you for asking that question, because I think there are some interesting examples here. We really had to be scrappy in a sense, because we were, we were in a big industry.
Yep.
Change was happening continually, and in order to get in front of these editors, we really needed to stand out. So one of the things that we did is we created a strategy around workplace disruption. And that worked really well for us, because when you think about it, Go to My PC is a product that allows you to work from anywhere. And we realized that with disruptions, it would be an invaluable tool to have. You'd still be able to get your work done without necessarily going to your office. So we identified different types of workplace disruption. Frankly, the first disruption was 9/11. And that happened in the fall, in September, following the spring launch that year. And I flew to New York shortly after that happened, within a couple of weeks, and hired a film crew to take footage of some customers who were using Go to My PC to be able to work remotely. And that, so we had it packaged into what was called a video news release. And it was a 90-second news piece that was then sent out to news stations across the country. In the smaller markets, not so much the major markets, they were looking for content. And so that proved to be quite effective. It was a subtle mention of Go to My PC. You know, it had to be subtle to be credible. So following that, we continued down that road. Here in Santa Barbara, there was some highway disruption that prevented, people from getting to work for a while. There were storms, or any number of disruptions. We were able to use a similar model, and that really worked well.
WeatherBug was one of our best partners for a period. WeatherBug nobody's even heard of anymore, but
yes,
it was a little Java applet that would alert you of weather, weather incidents. It's sort of like the floods coming or whatever. And we had a great partnership with them, because when a snowstorm was coming, it would be like, hey, do you want to still work from home? Click here. And so we just, so it's finding those little veins of gold.
Yes.
It's easy in retrospect.
Yes.
So you mentioned about print still being relevant. I'd love to. I have just two more questions, and then I'm going to open it up for the students. With the rise of social media and the not the demise of print, but the less emphasis on print. When you have conversations with your clients, how does that conversation go, and where do you see print still playing an important role?
Sure. Well, print is so broad. I would say certain print is still very important. Actually, there was a Pew Research that just came out recently, and it confirmed that more and more people are getting their news from television in this case, but through social media channels is rising as well. But that was the case 10 years ago in terms of people getting news from television. That's just the way it's been for a while. But TV news, and certainly the morning shows and the talk shows, typically get their content from publications like the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. So if
So
you're
you're
reading those
feeding-
newspapers, then, what a coincidence. The next day on the Today Show, you're going to see somebody talking about what was written about in the New York Times or the
Right,
Wall Street Journal.
right.
Because those publications have the resources to be able to produce those stories in a credible manner. With fake news being a huge concern
Yes.
and issue today,
Yep.
those media on the level of a New York Times and the Wall Street Journal are more and more important because those journalists, they don't produce fake news.
Right.
And if they do, they're fired and the reputation of those publications suffer.
Yes.
So in a sense, those publications at that tier remain very important. But certainly with social media, there's a convergence now. PR departments, corporate communications departments, and marketing departments need to work together and message carefully. Well, first of all, create the important messages and then determine how those messages should be shared through the different types of media. How you message to Facebook is going to be different to how you message to Twitter and how you message maybe in a press release.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting. I as you know, I've been writing for Forbes for a long time, almost 10 years. And I started out as a contributor, and they've kind of advanced me a little bit along. But what I've seen with their model is interesting. They're taking more and more content from fewer and fewer contributors. So sort of what you're saying, not just opening up their platform to everyone, but also augmenting that with journalists. What other trends do you see in the landscape over the next 10 years or so between print, social media, and how those two interplay?
Well, convergence is really happening in a big way now. And by that I mean marketing departments and corporate communications departments are converging. And that is largely because of the advent of social media and in particular analytics.
Yes, we've talked about that in here. Marketing analytics changed everything.
They're changing the game.
Yep.
They're forcing PR and marketing departments to be responsible. There has to be a return on investment.
Exactly.
Otherwise, there's no patience to continue down that road.
Yep.
So that is changing the game, and as a result, you're finding in many companies those departments are converging. You still have the specialties, but for example, it might be under a marketing head.
Yeah, right.
Whereas
or
years
CRO.
ago, that's right. It might have been where my department, for example, would have been right to the CEO.
Right. And
So-
in a way, there was almost an editorial wall that they wanted, right?
Oh,
Where
yes.
between John, the
Completely.
salesperson, his messaging is not going to be the corporate communications message.
That's
but I do
right.
think that because of the analytic tools, it's starting to be brought under one umbrella.
And there's something else that's on the horizon that I think is very exciting, and it's really augmented reality, or is sometimes known as eCommerce. And what it is, it's the convergence of virtual reality and social media and e-commerce, converging to create a way for consumers to have experiences with products before they buy them. So from what I have read, Amazon and Walmart are behind this in a big way. They're developing these systems that will allow their customers to experience makeup products, eyeglasses, or whatever.
The fit of a
more in a
product.
virtual manner than they could do before. So that's pretty exciting, and I think we're going to hear a lot more about that in the next few years.
Seeing how that product looks on you. So one example, I'm going to give a free, don't get mad at me, UCTV, but a free advertisement to a wine, I think it's called 19 Crimes or something, where they've taken just a basic wine bottle, and it has and when you understand their demographic they're selling to, it makes sense. They have a convict on their wine bottle, and it's this really scary looking person, and it's an Australian wine, so they're talking about our history of being settled by convicts. But when you hold your phone up to it, it comes to life, and this individual starts talking, and it's really eerie. but it underscores kind of who they're trying to go after, the rebel,
Sure.
the rule breaker, the whatever. So
Sure.
I think it's an interesting way to take a fairly static, plain
Yes.
label that every wine bottle has and turn it into something interesting.
Yes.
And they got a lot of PR and a lot of play out of that because, that's an article, that's a story.
Sure.
How do you use VR on your product? And of course, then 28,000 people imitate it.
Yes.
But the first one that gets that story out there really gets the views. So.
That's right. Because really, at the end of the day, good PR is all about telling stories.
Yes.
And
yes. Thank
you know, it's storytelling.
That's what we talk about here a lot.
Really, that's right. It's all about the stories, and
Because that's what people remember.
precisely.
remember
And when
stories.
you have consumers, the consumer experience, the end user experience in them, they are more memorable and more relevant
Right.
For the press.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
So let's take a few students' questions. We have our microphone over here. Who would like to kick off questions? So we have a question in the back. Please wait for the mic.
Hi, so first of all, thank you for coming to speak with us. Your insights have been really interesting. I don't have a background in publication really at all, so it's nice to hear a different perspective in the classroom. I was wondering, a lot of us are entrepreneurially focused and considering some sort of startup-based path, and because there are so many different advertising channels available right now, how would you recommend the smaller scale companies or startups getting some notoriety and some positive press?
Sure. I think, for a small startup company that may be short on resources too, they have to make some tough decisions about how they're going to spend their money and their resources to get market awareness. Typically, early stage companies would spend more money on public relations as a way to quickly and inexpensively build awareness and reputation for a product. Now, it's ideal to do both together.
Right.
But if a company has to choose between two, often going down the earned media route of working with press and social media would be the way to start because it's not as expensive. Advertising can be very expensive. But I'm not to say that that's not important, because it's very important. And then at the point where there are more resources, then certainly the advertising, the marketing, the lead generation, all of that needs to come into play, if not right away.
And I would, let's get the next question, we'll get the mic to you. What I would add to that is make sure that you're helping the author of this content by telling that story. Because they don't know the story as well as you do. So
yes.
Deliver the story to them. Not that you write the article for them, but understand what everyone's trying to get these people's attention. Why should they write about us? What's unique? How are we different? And say that in a story. Next question.
Hi, thanks so much for coming. Where do you see the future of public relations going with the advent of new technologies like augmented reality and virtual reality? And how might these technologies affect and transform this industry?
Well, yeah, a good question. I think, in terms of, where is the industry going? The internet still, internet changed everything in public relations.
Right.
And it's still a major force. Social media, made possible through the internet. These are things that are continuing to change the PR landscape. I mentioned convergence, analytics. That's changing the game, in terms of how we communicate our messaging and the channels that we use.
And the transparency, right? In the old days,
yes.
there was a playbook, and you went on Good Morning
Yes.
America, and you apologized, and you did all these things. Now it's that
Yes.
playbook's getting shredded.
Yes, that's right. So on the one hand, it's a very exciting time because things are changing so quickly.
Right.
But it's also it's difficult to be able to react
also a challenging
when they're
time.
changing so quickly.
But you know what? When there's challenges, there's opportunities. And so
Yes.
a young person
Yes.
entering this world today, I think, has an advantage
Yes.
because they haven't
tremendous.
necessarily been exposed to that playbook over and over and over again, and they can help write the new playbook. So that's what you guys should do.
Yes, that's right. And I would add one more thing to the idea of convergence and how media is changing. There are other types of companies getting into the game now and creating content. For example, even publications now, newspapers, they're also creating content in a different way. There are companies that were not traditional public relations or companies that are getting into the game and creating content. So in a sense, there are more competitors.
The lines are blurring.
That the PR industry has to deal with.
Yeah.
The lines are blurring.
Inside companies.
McKinsey, I mean, companies
Yeah,
like that,
right.
you know, are also, they're getting into the game of content
And
development.
analysts, you could argue that analysts are too.
Analysts, big time,
Yeah.
big time.
Yeah.
You see more analysts creating stories
Right.
in publications and in online portals.
Yep, and that's just going to keep happening.
That's right.
Laura, thank you so
Definitely.
much for coming. We really appreciate it.
You're very
Thank you.
welcome. I'm delighted to be here.